Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody. That's hopefully for somebody. It is another feature film review. Typically, I guess that's what the episodes are for, unless it's a television series. It's been a long weekend for me. I went on a guy's trip, spent 10 hours in the car yesterday. So I hope I have enough energy for this episode. This will be, of course, a review of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Timecodes will be listed in the description for the general thoughts and for the spoilers if you do not want the film ruined, if you have not had a chance to see it yet. I don't want to waste any more time. Let's get into the general review of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 was written and directed again by James Gunn, potentially the last film he will ever make for Marvel. If you are listening to this, you know that he is now in charge of DCU, the co-president of DC Studios, and he will be directing Superman Legacy, which will be also written by him. That film has a release date, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. We return to the Guardians. There, I guess, are going to be general spoilers for the holiday special if you have not watched that yet, so I guess avoid this section as well. But my general thoughts on the film are that I really enjoyed it. I was not a fan of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. I personally felt that there was a significant amount of rehash, particularly with Rocket's character and his core relationship with the other Guardians. There is a substantial amount of setup in that film for a character that does make an appearance in this film. And unfortunately, that is an element that I don't think you did necessarily need in the movie. That particular character I will get into in spoilers because I don't want to actually tell you who it is because that could be construed as spoilers. However, the focus in this film is on Rocket Raccoon. That is something established by James Gunn in the marketing material. We know through the trailers and clips that the High Evolutionary is in the film, and we know that we will see some of Rocket's backstory and the relationships he had prior to even meeting Groot and the Guardians. I'm happy to say that I think that this is my favorite of the Guardians films. One could argue that the first one is better, but the specific focus on one of the characters who, quite frankly, in my opinion, did not get a substantial amount of story in 1 and 2 volumes, where we got teases to Rocket's backstory, but the focus really for the first 2 volumes of this trilogy was on Peter, specifically with founding the team, maybe more so an ensemble, but obviously with 2 being all about Peter's relationship with his father Ego, who was of course played by Kurt Russell. Now, this film is the culmination of this trilogy of their technically 5-movie arc, given how the Guardians played a substantial role in Infinity War and Endgame. We do get to see a continuation on where Gamora has gone since her 2014 self was brought into the present. The time specifically for this, I'm not exactly sure, but the emotional core of this film is Rocket Raccoon, and I feel that giving the film that focus on a character, as I said earlier, that did not have a substantial amount to do in the first 2 films, I would say that I think there are some substantially interesting scenes with Rocket and Thor, particularly in the 2 Avengers films, and we can see how the relationships have developed if you watch all 5 of those films in one large sitting. I typically would like to do some form of rewatch prior to seeing the end of a series. While this may not be the end, it probably is the end of this version of the Guardians, given how James Gunn is moving on, as I said already, to other things. The performance from the visual effects department to whatever Sean Gunn has done on set. If you are unaware, Sean typically is acting out the role of Rocket on set, so that way the actors don't have to act against a tennis ball, because actors acting to actors always gets a better result as opposed to nothing being there. Great examples for this are a substantial amount of motion capture done with Andy Serkis as Gollum, and most of the apes in the Planet of the Apes trilogy by Matt Reeves and Rupert Wyatt. And you can certainly see the level of relationships between all of the Guardians has evolved. This is the most substantial jump in time. Again, given how this is post Endgame, we briefly did see them in Thor: Love and Thunder, but I don't see how that really plays out into this. More just a cameo, in my opinion. Going on. Bradley Cooper does a phenomenal job as Rocket Raccoon. The range of emotion that this character is able to present, and as something that audience members and critics have been critical of Marvel even more frequently in Phase 4 and now into Phase 5, is the visual effects. The visual effects on all of the animal creatures. A substantial amount of this movie does have to do with science fiction elements, and visual effects are required for that. But as somebody who is a big fan of practical elements, this film has these. Nowhere, which is the Guardians of the Galaxy headquarters, is a massive set. We did see that as well in Guardians of the Galaxy, the holiday special, which establishes a couple things in the time that has passed since Endgame. I really enjoyed the intimacy of this story. It's interesting how we get to see Rocket's backstory. It's not just necessarily a bunch of flashbacks. I won't exactly explain that, but having that be what is driving the Guardians outside of Gamora, who is doing something else, makes for a more emotional film and a grounded film where the Guardians are not focusing on pulling off a necessary scheme for their own benefit. Everyone is focused on Rocket. And I think, there's the first one, that the performances suited to that work very well. The evolution of these characters continues to fit with the arcs we've seen them in these 5 films moving forward. There was a character I mentioned already who I believe is set up for the future, and if you are a knowledgeable comic book reader, you may know who I am talking about. That character is given some fun things to do, but ultimately I don't believe adds enough to the story for that level of significance to be given to this character. It's very inconsistent, and it plays to a trope that, quite frankly, I'm tired of. I can explain more of that in spoilers. The music is more interesting in this film. We do have the Zune, so it does allow for music not just from the 70s and early 80s, which certainly adds a variety that the other 2 Guardians films were not able to do. It has been established, would probably be the best way to phrase it, that James Gunn can sometimes use pre-written songs, commercially released songs, to emphasize an emotion and a point. And I've seen some criticism of that for this film. I don't necessarily disagree, but the choice of music for the scenes that are used in this film, I felt worked a lot better than the Suicide Squad, which, quite frankly, had a jukebox soundtrack that seemed to be all the heavy lifting as opposed to the writing. In all of the films that I have seen James Gunn write and direct, I'm not including Scooby-Doo in that because he didn't direct them, that this is his most emotional script. I think it is his most well executed in terms of what is the story. The performances, as I said already, that he is able to get from the cast are some of the best they've been able to deliver in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And with that, I'm very excited to see what he does with the DCU. I'm more cautious about what directors and writers he works with, if he is helping not scope, but mold the DCU and what those stories are going to be. It is interesting that this film probably would have come out sooner. One of its benefits is that it does not have to rely on the other multiversal universal expansion that we are getting with the multiverse saga, eventually resulting in 2 Avengers films. It's able to focus on the Guardians aspect of the MCU, and it's better for that. The focus is something I appreciate, where there are, as I've said already, not loose threads, but elements that certainly will be carried forward into Guardians of the Galaxy. Maybe it'll be titled Volume 4. If I had to guess, it won't be. It'll be titled Guardians of the Galaxy, subtitle something. New Order, Nova, something like that. Those are not spoilers because those are things that have not been established in the film. But overall, it is a heartwarming experience. I didn't cry. I did see that a lot of people had been, but I was emotional throughout the film. It's quite funny. The visuals are something we're used to with the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. It's fun and it's weird. It is a cameo fest in a good way where we are seeing people we are used to seeing in James Gunn films. But ultimately, as a cap on his trilogy, I think he did a great job. It is certainly not the worst of the trilogy. I don't even know why I'm phrasing it in this way, but I enjoyed it substantially more than 2. And on any given day, I might say that it's better than Volume 1. That's hard to judge given how 1 set everything up and this is paying things off, but the firm conclusion may not be as firm as you are expecting, given how this is an end of a trilogy, but I'll let you decide that for yourself. Let me know what you thought if you've seen it and you just want to talk non-spoiler related elements of the film. But now I'm going to be jumping into spoilers for, of course, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Spoilers ahead for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. If you do not want to be spoiled, then I suggest, heading to the outro and hopefully giving me a 5-star review or even any star review, because anything that helps the algorithm say, hey, this podcast from one guy in Canada is not so bad. Spoilers for Guardians of the Galaxy 3. So the main plot of the film is driven through the fact that we see Adam Warlock, who is after Rocket Raccoon, who has been hired by the High Evolutionary to get his brain, because Rocket, of all of the High Evolutionary's creations, is the only one that's been capable of original thought, something he requires in setting up the new world. It is an element of the film that makes sense in a retcon sort of way. The Sovereign are established as this perfect human race, and it does fit in with the High Evolutionary's goals, but he certainly seems to be focused on having an anthropomorphic, animalistic, perfect world, and we get to see an example of that, and his works in progress, where we get to meet Rocket, Teefs, Lila, and I can't remember the fourth one. Wheels. Nope. Teefs. I don't remember. Legs. There's a bunny and it's horrifying, and I can't believe I forget what the heck it's called. But that doesn't matter right now. So we get to see that element, and Rocket is severely injured in the first altercation, and they are unable to work on Rocket because of tech that has been implanted into him by the High Evolutionary, who is played by, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing this, Chakudi Iwuji, who was also in Peacemaker. The manic nature of this character I really enjoy. The intellect is, of course, present, and how this person has continually evolved themselves and is considered a god amongst a certain percentage of the galaxy that the Guardians are working in. To the Sovereign, he believes that there is no god, which is why he has to do what he's doing to solve the universe's lack of perfection and the errors that are occurring. He's very, very captivating, and I like his obsessiveness over this one particular thing and why he's obsessed with Rocket. Somebody whose intelligence has been demonstrated throughout all of the 5 films, building tech for himself as well as the other Guardians. And we are getting Rocket's flashbacks in his own head as the movie is moving on. We get to see more and more of Rocket's life and how tragic it is. And it does certainly fit well with Rocket's lack of understanding of why these things did happen to him, and when we see him intoxicated in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1. And I'm certainly think that going back and watching all 3 of these, it will work much better. But it is a scene that seems like nothing, but is much more impactful afterwards, which I really appreciate when I wouldn't even consider a retcon, but more of the story is told, improving the past. The MCU has suffered from telling more and it taking away from certain elements of the films, My least favorite one as of now is Nick Fury's eye being the result of a flurkin, which I believe is what that cat's called, and it takes away from what an incredible scene that is when we do see the reveal in Captain America the Winter Soldier. So that's the driving force for this. As I mentioned in the non-spoilers, has nothing to do with going to retrieve something for them selfishly. Everyone, obviously outside of Gamora, is determined to get, whether that's a password or specifically go straight to the High Evolutionary for this password that will unlock the tech and they can access them without the failsafe going off and ultimately killing Rocket. The relationship between Peter and Rocket is very much at the forefront with Chris Pratt in this film. In my opinion, it's the best performance we've had from Chris Pratt in all of these films. Now, he keeps saying it's his best friend, and I would love to have seen whatever relationship James Gunn thinks we saw in the 4 previous appearances. It works in this film, but out of the whole 5 movies, I don't know if that lands as well as they would have hoped. I'm going to get back into Adam Warlock because I mentioned him earlier in the non-spoilers without actually saying him. He's a big baby man, and this trope of having a big, powerful character and having the intelligence of a young child, I've seen too much from James Gunn at this point, with Groot sort of growing up and dying and then coming back. That element has changed. We saw the teenage Groot, and we've now seen, I guess, adult Groot 2.0, King Shark and the Suicide Squad. It's a trope that I don't necessarily enjoy very much. It would have been much more interesting, given Will Poulter is a good comedic actor and does well with what he is given, but that character ironically feels tacked on to this story. The Sovereign are barely in the movie, and his arc in realizing that there's this family that chose to be with each other, I don't think it lands as effectively as it could have if the Sovereign were in the movie for longer. We get to see the 2 or 1 from the previous film, and then we get to see him. And they are serving the High Evolutionary because he is their creator. It's an element that certainly adds to Volume 2, but I wish he was in the movie more so that way that story seemed more complete. It feels like it was an element that was on a first draft and that didn't get expanded on as the script for the film was written. It is a character that is definitely going to continue moving forward. I'm jumping way ahead, but that character does eventually join the Guardians in a post-credit scene. Of course, Adam Warlock is a character from the comics that is heavily involved in the cosmic end and the Guardians of the Galaxy. There's a ton of stuff that you can read up all about his impact on the whole universe that maybe we'll get to. Who knows? If you're fighting a guy like Kang, that might be important. So that may be an element that does move forward outside of the Guardians of the Galaxy films. We do get to see Nebula really fill in the role of Gamora with the team. Gamora's role in the story I really enjoyed because we do not get a rehash of their relationship. Peter is stuck in, I love this woman, we have this history, but she doesn't know it. But Gamora is incapable of having that history given the fact that she did not live it. So the characters are in a rock and a hard, or at a rock and a hard place, because they will never be able to meet each other even halfway, because Peter can't go back in time and forget his memories. I'm glad that's an element that does not come up, and it's not resolved. He realizes she is not going to be the person that he fell in love with and ultimately needs to let her go and move on with his life, leaving Peter to come to the decision that he's going to fight for Rocket and he is going to go home and see his grandfather, who we've not seen since Peter was abducted by Yondu in Guardians of the Galaxy 1. I think that as an end for now to that story, that was a satisfying ending to Peter's story. The very end of the movie teases that Star-Lord will return. I'm hoping that that has to do with Nova. I'm assuming a lot of people are going to have that opinion, given the fact that we do get Nova, and Peter's relationship with Xandar certainly would make sense if he was involved in some way in that story. Karen Gillan, again, as Nebula, I thoroughly enjoyed what they've done with that character. Her arc from 1 all the way through, and the relationship we clearly see her develop with Rocket after the Guardians got snapped or blipped out of existence continues to carry forward as she cares so much that Peter and her save Rocket. We get to see the origin of Rocket's name, which I really liked. Drax and, oh my goodness, Mantis continue their back and forth relationship, which I think is done much more effectively in this film as opposed to just the farce that it was in the holiday special. If you're curious about how I feel about that as a whole, I did do an episode on that. It also included a tier list for all of Phase 4, which you can find there, or if you just want to see it, the photo is posted on the Instagram and Twitter at Film Realist. Don't forget E-list. Realist has 2 E's. So their relationship evolves in a way, and each member of the Guardians does get to see a side of the characters that we had not seen yet. Particularly Nebula's relationship with Drax evolves in such a great way where we have not seen those characters interact in a significant fashion, and Nebula coming to the realization that Drax, while being this brute force person, at the center of it is a dad, and that certainly fits with Drax's mission as a whole. Started off, had to do with something of vengeance, and ultimately becomes his biggest but his best attribute, in that he can care for those who cannot care for themselves. And I really enjoyed that. There are subtle moments that remind me how great an actor Dave Bautista is in this film, and I'm happy for him that he's been allowed to expand on what he's been capable of as an actor, specifically in something like Dune. We're going to get to see more of him in Dune Part 2, which I'm looking forward to this fall. Groot is Groot. He says some words. Zoe Saldana is in the movie less, and I don't know if that's a result of the Avatar films potentially shooting around the time that this shot, but that character maybe has the least to do outside of Adam Warlock. But I like where that character leaves. She is a member of the Ravengers, and that is her family now. Kraglin is in it. Sean Gunn is funny as per usual, but again, there's not much done with Kraglin. As a whole, I said this in the non-spoiler section. I really enjoyed the film. The emotional core of the film's focus on Rocket worked really well, in my opinion, and everything around it, outside of Adam Warlock, was a success. This isn't a firm conclusion. There's never going to be any more Guardians films. There likely will be, but they will be done potentially in a different style. I believe I've said this on the podcast before, but I think Edgar Wright would be a great person to take over if you wanted a very different style, and potentially somebody who also likes to use music in their films in a completely different aesthetic to some degree, as James Gunn would be really great. The visual spectacle of this film continues to hold up from the other 2. There's some very weird psychedelic scenes that certainly fit with Steve Ditko, Jack Kirby elements of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or from the comics, both. It works for both. I would recommend this film. If you are a fan of the Guardians films just in general, I think you could go and watch this. If you are caught up with all of the MCU, I believe that this is a great, hey, remember we make pretty good movies after Ant-Man and the Wasp's Quantumania. I'm very curious to see what the Marvels does after this. That is our next MCU film, which comes out in November. Let me know what you thought on Twitter. As I said, you can have a spoiler discussion. We can have a non-spoiler discussion. Probably not public, maybe in an email. The email for the show is, of course, listed in the podcast notes. Next week's episode will be, I actually don't know. I haven't scheduled anything in yet. I'm not sure of what movies come out. I probably should have checked that. It may be The Mandalorian Season 3 review. I have not finished that show yet. I took a pause, but I am slowly working my way through. But if you want an up-to-date announcement as to what I will be reviewing, you can find that on the Twitter or the Instagram for the podcast. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope to see you on the next one.